So in December 1976, my life was completely immersed in rock and roll. I was playing in a band, I was interviewing tons of artists and writing articles and going to shows several times a week. I mean, it was just my life. And personally, I was almost entirely into English bands. There were a few cool American bands I liked, but there were groups like Lynyrd Skynyrd and songs like Sweet Home Alabama. What's the one? Give Me Back My Bullets and Free Bird, which were a lot of people's jam, but not mine. Lynyrd Skynyrd always seemed to be in the background, though. You know, and it felt like they played at literally every festival and big summer arena show. And I would be there, but I would just kind of ignore them, right? They were just there. So when I was assigned by Teen Magazine to go to Detroit for a couple days on their private plane, and write a feature about it, I was excited, but I was slightly apprehensive. I was sure I'd be a total stranger in a strange land of bearded Southern guys, moonshine, Confederate flags, right? I was to meet Lynyrd Skynyrd in Milwaukee on December 5th. The weather report for that day said that it was going to be a high of 17 degrees and a low of 7. Ooh. I begged and borrowed all the warm clothes I could to cover my LA punky wardrobe. I had an early start at LAX and spent most of 2 flights and a layover in Chicago poring over a press kit photo and a bio, trying to memorize all the band members' names, and there were like a lot of them. And I tried to tie their names to an instrument they played, who had a beard I had, who looked like a cartoon character or someone I had met in my life. I just didn't want to be dismissed as like an LA airhead who knew nothing about them, like, because I didn't. And so at 11:30 that night, after the band's Milwaukee show, I arrived at the airfield where their 30-year-old, strikingly unglamorous Convair plane was parked. The band's assistant tour manager, Dean Kilpatrick, met me and helped me drag my bags on. The heat in the rickety Convair couldn't kick in until it was airborne, so I shivered uncontrollably. I had never been in 7-degree weather before, let alone 15 below zero, with a wind chill factor. So as we took off, I settled into a pair of seats under the front and tried to make out a flurry of heated, dare I say, conversation behind us. Back of the plane, I was glancing at the press kit for the 50th time when guitarist Gary Rossington, with a wide, boyish grin, walked up holding a bottle of Jack Daniels. "Hi, I'm Gary," he said. "You're on the road with us for some teenage magazine, right?" I nodded, not sure where he was going. "Well, we're not exactly teen idol material," he said, and I laughed. "So," he continued, "if you're going to hang with us, you're going to have to show us what you're made of." He held out the bottle of Jack Daniels. I reached for the bottle of Jack and took what I hoped would be a respectable swig before handing it back. What else would you do? He nodded. I guess I passed the test. And he nodded his head back and said, it'll warm you up. So I said, what's going on back there? Referring to the intense conversation. Gary paused, and then he replied that somebody close to the band had died the night before. Oh, I said, I'm sorry, somebody you worked with. A friend, he said, a guitar player named Tommy Bolin. I gasped. Tommy Bolin was a friend of mine, as well as a beautiful, kind kid that I hung out with in LA. He was a brilliant musician who, if you don't know anything about him, you should look him up. Barely out of his teens, Tommy played with Deep Purple, the James Gang, Billy Cobham, and churned out a couple solo albums. He OD'd in Miami the night before. Tears welled up in my eyes. Gary reached forward and hugged me. Crying together, we sealed a friendship. Instantly, I lost all my cynicism towards Lynyrd Skynyrd. I was with Tommy's friends. He was gone, and we were grieving. Detroit was less than 2 hours away, and in the late hour, with the hustle of travel and the heaviness of emotion, I couldn't wait to crash out at the Holiday Inn we were booked at. The next afternoon, cassette recorder in hand, I interviewed Lynyrd Skynyrd's charismatic lead singer, Ronnie Van Zant. By then, he had heard that I knew Tommy, and despite Ronnie's mythic reputation for brawling and drinking and general bad behavior, with me, he was sweet and present and down to earth. We talked about our mutual friend and all the band stuff I'd need for the story. Just after soundtrack, I met the Honkettes, the band's 3 backup singers, Leslie Hawkins, Joe Billingsley, and Cassie Gaines, who were a total hoot. They were colorful, shit-talking, super-friendly Southern girls with brilliant voices and spot-on harmonies. They were unlike anyone I had ever met before, and I felt they were checking in to see if I was doing okay with that whole scene, that none of the boys had been misbehaving around me. That night, seriously listening to the band for the first time with Ronnie as master of ceremonies and the Honkettes rollicking background vocals, Lynyrd Skynyrd was undeniably impressive. I got how powerful and skilled the players were. 3 formidable guitar players, a ragtime meets rock and roll hyper-dexterous pianist, and a wild man drummer. They just killed it. The devoted, sold-out crowd was totally locked in. The energy was contagious, and I was surprised by my own rapt attention, and even caught myself sort of dancing, singing along. The show's last song was Freebird, an anthem as loved as it is mocked, and Ronnie dedicated it to my friend Tommy, who I learned had jammed with him on it just 3 months earlier at a tour date in Wisconsin. To me, Miss LA UK snob, Freebird was suddenly lush, gorgeous, and poignant. Every Bic lighter in the place went on. After the last encore, Ronnie announced to the entourage that there would be a wake for Tommy back at the hotel. I was honored to be included and teased not to write about it in Teen Magazine. Everyone drank Jack as we went around the room telling stories, toasting our friends. It was amazing. Not only was I no longer a stranger in this strange land, I was there under the auspices of Teen Magazine, living a story I would have no opportunity to report. The next day, I had a chance to interview a couple other band members, and once again, that night, Freebird was dedicated to Tommy. Bics went up, and we all drank ourselves into near oblivion at another wake. Dean, the assistant tour manager, told me they were all flying to Jacksonville the next day for one of the roadies' weddings. He thought it would be easiest if I came along and returned home from there. Settled into another Holiday Inn, I began trying to draft my article. I realized how fond I had become of everyone and how I had come to sort of understand their huge, rocking, what I dismissed as cliche sound. At the wedding, Ronnie Van Zant invited me to come back to Florida sometime to go bass fishing with him and his family. I was touched. Returning home, my bandmates and my LA friends couldn't believe my flood of stories and sudden reverence for Lynyrd Skynyrd. My prejudices busted open. I realized how judgmental I had been. In those few days, I kind of grew to love them for who they were, for being so entirely different than my friends and me. I was grateful they pried open that window. So in August '77, Lynyrd Skynyrd played in Anaheim with Foreigner, REO Speedwagon, and Ted Nugent. Anyone remember any of those? Okay. I went backstage to visit the band. It was a friendly reunion, and Ronnie sweetly reiterated the bass fishing offer. It never happened, though. In mid-October, staying at my parents' home while recuperating from a tonsillectomy, a couple friends called, desperate to track me down. They needed to make sure I heard the news. The same rickety plane I had gone out in with Lynyrd Skynyrd was leaking fuel, but the band and pilot agreed to wait till they got to the next city to have it checked out. Instead, they crashed into a woodsy patch in some place called Gillsburg, Mississippi. The story was that the drummer, Artemis, high on acid, climbed out of the downed plane, ran to a farmer's house for help, and was shot as an intruder before he could communicate about the crash. When the emergency vehicle showed up, it was learned that Ronnie Van Zant, backup singer Cassie Gaines, her brother, guitarist Steve Gaines, and Dean Kilpatrick were among the 6 who died. Everyone else was seriously injured. It was a monstrous event, and hearing the news, my heart shattered. I could barely find words to express my sadness. No one I knew could relate to how personal this tragic story that filled the newspapers was to me. The people I had grieved Tommy Bolin with less than a year before were now gone as well. I was grateful to them for being so authentic and welcoming, for allowing me to process with them. I learned a lot from them about how it's done, how grief is done, honored, and I lifted well more than one shot of Jack Daniels to them in the weeks that followed. It had to be a year later that I ran into Gary Rossington at the Roxy in LA. We didn't say a word about the accident. There was no need. We just hugged and asked each other how we were. Thank you.